And good evening from New Zealand, and welcome to this Global Research Alliance webinar on Global Research Alliance flagships. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. This webinar is being recorded. The format will be two speakers with questions and answers following the speakers. Please, if you're asking questions, could you use the question and answer function and not the chat function? And it would be also extremely helpful if you could use the upvote button so that we can help prioritize some of the questions. And just a reassurance, it may well be that we can't answer all of the questions that people ask tonight, but rest assured we will be collating any questions that are not answered and posting the answers on our website. I just want to now share my screen. There we go. And just again, a little bit more. So there's a very short introduction from me about the GRA and GRA flagships. And then we have two presentations this evening, one from Dr. David Yáñez-Ruiz from Spain and on technical guidelines to develop feed additives to reduce enteric methane. And then we follow that with a presentation from Dr. Klaus de Blitz from the Thunen Institute in Germany, who will look at the economics of GHG mitigation at farm level in global cattle production systems. So I'm now waiting for my, we have a delay on moving there. Just an introduction to the Global Research Alliance, perhaps for those who don't really know what the Global Research Alliance is. Now, this was an organization formed in 2010, starting with about 24 countries, aimed at trying to produce more food with less emissions, and doing this via greater collaboration in the research effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. It has grown from those 24 countries who signed a memorandum of understanding back in 2010 to now 66 member countries spread around the globe. And as well as those countries, we have approximately 24 partner organizations who also agree to work towards those collective goals of reducing emissions without reducing food production. And the engine of the Global Research Alliance is the research work we undertake, and that is mainly undertaken under 4 research groups, in which we have a rice research group, a livestock research group, croplands research group, and an integrative research group. And then below the research groups, we have science networks. And for example, we have networks on animal genetics and genomics, rumen genetics and genomics, feed to reduce emissions, etc. And just to give you a flavor of the activities of the Global Research Alliance, we've had in excess of 72 collaborative projects. We've worked a lot on increasing the capacity and capability to undertake work on greenhouse gases, with close to 200 fellowships now been awarded to help increase that capacity and capability. We've produced a lot of guidelines to help in work, to guide work on greenhouse gases, and in excess of 40 technical workshops. And collectively, we have around 3,000 scientists involved in Global Research Alliance activities. And as well as, sorry, I'm having trouble here, as well as the member countries, our partners are exceedingly important, because the partners sign up to the same aims as the countries, and they're important partners in the work we do. So we have funding partners, we have partners who get involved in the collective research effort, and the GRA couldn't do its work without these partners. And just to move on as to what are flagships, what is this entity called a flagship? And these are what term, perhaps the highest level of research partnership we undertake in the Global Research Alliance. And these are projects that we have with a very defined outcome and a very defined timeline. So they're discrete projects where we're trying to get a defined outcome that's of benefit to all GRA members. And to ensure that, we're wanting to look for projects that can have wide GRA member involvement, where there are opportunities to get involved at various levels. And this can be through data sharing, it can be providing samples, knowledge sharing, and it can be helping provide funding. But what we're trying to do with flagship projects is ensure that they have broad benefit across the GRA, and we have opportunities for broad participation across the GRA, with costs not being a barrier to participation. And the research we undertake in Flagship should generate new knowledge, and it should, as I mentioned before, be using the community of experts that makes up the GRA membership. And obviously, we always want to make sure that these projects have the strongest opportunity to succeed. So we do need to have very strong leadership. So they need to have an identified project lead. We do need to have some core funding. It's not expected that they are fully funded at the outset, but they do need some core funding to start the flagships, and that the flagships should have some proposed funding mechanisms by which additional activities and contributions can be identified. So they do have to pass quite a high bar to get the approval by the GRA Council to be flagships. And so to get flagship approval from the member countries of the GRA and the partners in the GRA, there must be at least 5 members and partners who will agree to support the flagship. The 3 of those must be members. And once the flagships are put forward on an agreed template, the council representatives assess the flagships using the criteria I've already outlined, and then they get the GRA endorsement. And getting endorsement really means that the council members will try their best to obtain resources and encourage broad involvement in the GRA flagship projects. And we profile these, and we're monitoring the flagship projects, and they will be presented to council to look at how well they've succeeded at the end of their process. So now I'd really like to hand over to my first speaker tonight, which is David Yáñez-Ruiz from Spain, who is going to talk about the flagship project on feed additives. Now, David did his PhD in veterinary science, specializing in ruminant nutrition and nutritional means to modify rumen fermentation. He has worked initially in Wales, and then followed by permanent work in Spain since 2007, interspersed with visiting researcher status in both New Zealand and Australia with CSIRO. Currently, he's involved in 3 Horizons 2020 projects and is the coordinator of the Horizon Europe project, facilitating innovations for resilient livestock farming systems, and which continues from 2020 through to 2027. David has been involved in the GRA close to since its inception. He's a special representative. He's the representative for Spain in the Global Research Alliance, and he also chairs the Feed and Nutrition Network. So over to you, David.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you, Harry, for the introduction, for presenting the flagship projects, and for facilitating this session. And thank you for colleagues from the Global Research Alliance for organizing the workshop. So, let's see if I can, get this working. So as Harry said, there are a number of flagship projects that are going to start now, and one of them is the one that I'm coordinating together with Andre Banning, and is on developing technical guidelines to facilitate the development and the use of feed additives to reduce enteric methane emissions. The flagship is coordinated by myself in Spain and by Andre Banning in the Netherlands. And recently we had Florencia Garcia from Argentina who joined the team and is going to be working with us for the next 2 years. And there you have her email address as the main contact for any questions or requests that you may have related to this flagship project. So the project formally started when Florencia joined the team on the 1st of September of this year. So we've been working for a short time, and it's going to be running for the next 2 years. And to give you a bit of a background, I guess I don't need to provide much detail on the justification of the increasing interest in developing feed additives to reduce methane emissions worldwide. If you look at the different mitigation strategies in relation to nutrition in the ruminant livestock sector, there are different options, and this is a graph from a recent paper that we published from the Feeding and Nutrition Network in PNAS, in which we assessed through a meta-analysis the potential of different mitigation options, and we identified those based on the use of feed additives or methane inhibitors, the ones that offer the best potential to target or to meet that 1.5 target degrees in the near future. So we know that from the nutrition perspective, the use of feed additives, the work is one of the strategies that we need to implement. And we also know that there's been a huge research effort in the last 10, 15, 20 years on testing and trying to develop feed additives. This is an exercise I did yesterday. I typed feed additive methane emissions in Google Scholar, and I got 40,000 hits. And if you go to PubMed and type additives methane, then you get over 5,000 hits. So quite a lot of work done in the academic sector in trying to identify and develop feed additives to reduce methane emissions. But despite this huge effort, we know that the number of compounds and products that are available in the market is very limited. And to show or to illustrate that, I think we can use a recent report supported by the Global Research Alliance and the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Research Centre, led by Roger Hegarty, on evaluating the evidence for both efficacy and applicability of methane inhibiting feed additives for livestock. It's a very comprehensive report. I recommend to read, and maybe we can use this graph as a kind of summary of the findings and the analysis that was conducted in this exercise. And as you can see, the number of additives or the compounds that are available is relatively limited. And if we looked at the ones that offer a very high methane reduction potential, so above 25%, we have only 2 or 1 in case of nitrate that can reduce methane between 15 and 25%. So the number of candidates is limited, but if we look for those that have high reduction potential, is even more limited. And then in some cases, the confidence in efficacy, it's not very high. And then there are many other issues in relation to potential animal health and welfare risks, and also further development, especially in formulations for grazing systems that need to have further development. So if you go through this comprehensive report, you may ask yourself 2 questions. One is, can we accelerate the development of feed additives to reduce methane emissions? So can we go faster in this process? And for those that are ready to be implemented and be used in the market, how can we monitor that they're being used well, and how can we accurately account for the reductions, the we can achieve, which is something that the industry is in need now that one or two of them are going to come into the market in the short future. So to answer these two questions is the reason to initiate this project. And for that, we first had a general aim, which is to facilitate the development and use of feed additives to reduce enteric methane emissions. And for that, we have like two specific objectives. The first one, which is the main one, is to provide both the scientific community and the livestock industry sector technical guidelines on good practices to test and develop feed additives. Harry was mentioning the Global Research Alliance through the research networks and their research groups have already produced a number of technical guidelines, and this would be another one. And in this aspect of testing and developing, we will address how to investigate the different factors that are involved in the efficacy of different additives across a number of different production systems that use different diets, different animals, different management systems. And also, as a second part, investigate and try to uncover the mode of action of these additives so we can optimize the use, so we know when they work better, when they don't work, and also facilitate the second main objective, which is the registration. So the second specific objective is trying to facilitate the registration process of feed additives. And there we have the challenge of considering the different regulatory contexts that we have around the world, and that's quite challenging, but we need to account for that. And also how to help the industry and the governments to account for these for the reduction in emissions when feed additives are being used, so they can be translated accurately to inventories at different scales, not only farm scale, but also region, sector, or countries. So to address these two main objectives on the technical guidelines, we're not starting from scratch. So we have done some work, and I should say that this flagship project was initially conceived in the Feed and Nutrition Network. Harry was mentioning some of the networks, and in this network within the Livestock Research Group, we have produced a number of papers on guidelines on the in vitro techniques to assess enteric methane mitigation in ruminants, in vivo techniques, uncertainties in methane inventories, and how to produce or use some prediction equations to estimate methane production, and there are others. So we have some material and experience in this field, but that these aspects were all addressed as individually, separately, and sometimes we were not addressing in full the feed additives. So the aim is to try to have a more holistic view and concentrate on the aspects of the testing feed additives to reduce methane and facilitate the development in the academic and in the industry sector. So to give you an idea of what we have ahead in the coming 2 years, we have like different steps to follow. And the first one is what we're working at the moment, is defining the structure and the sections of the technical guidelines. So we have a kind of framework of what topics and areas are going to are aiming to cover in this report, in this document, and this is mainly what I'm going to present in the coming slides. And the aim is to present this structure of the sections as a statement of intentions in the next Climate Summit in the second and the third week of November in Cairo, in Egypt. Then, once we've got this structure defined, we will allocate contributions for each section to participant partners. And I should emphasize that although this project was conceived in the Feed and Nutrition Network, is a Global Research Alliance project that is open to any participant from the Global Research Alliance, for the scientific community, from the industry that it's interested in participating in the guidelines. So once we have interest notified from different contributors, we will establish working groups that will be working on gathering, processing data, discussing and writing the first drafts, and hopefully in less than 2 years' time we can deliver the technical guidelines and position papers on the different areas. So what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes, it's just to present very briefly the structure that we're working at the moment, so you can have a flavor of what kind of topics we aim to cover in the guidelines. So we're going to divide the guidelines in 2 blocks, one dealing with the purely experimental work and testing at lab level, and then the second one will be dealing more with testing at farm level and use some modeling exercises and deal with the implementation at different levels. So in the first block, we have 3 chapters. The first one on identifying and screening the candidates, the second one on testing at animal level, and then the third one on trying to uncover the mode of action. And then in the second block, we have 2 chapters dealing with testing at farm level, and then all the aspects related to registration and accounting. So I'm going to just briefly go over these 5 chapters to present you an idea, and of course to try to get a feedback from you as well on what we might be missing or what we might be considering in a different manner. So in the first chapter, which is going to deal with the identification and screening of new bioactive compounds, we are aware that computing and computational technology has developed quite rapidly in the last years. So we need to provide some guidelines and advice on how to use the silico screening and computational modeling softwares on trying to identify targets and potential candidates to reduce methane emissions using different metabolic pathways. Then obviously we still can make a huge use of the in vitro techniques. They are simple, relatively simple, cheap. Most labs can afford some of these in vitro techniques, from batch culture to continuous culture to semi-continuous culture, and they have different specificities that need to be considered in terms of the dosage, in terms of the substrates, in terms of the dilution rate, in terms of the measuring methane at different time intervals, and what other parameters to measure. So there are different aspects that we have covered in previous papers, but we want to compile all of them specifically for testing feed additives. And as I said, for the computational power, we also have access to chromatography and mass spectrometry, powerful techniques nowadays that we can also help us to characterize those compounds in a better way. On the second level, once the candidates have been identified, we want to provide guidelines on how to transform the dosage and the levels of inclusion that we used previously in vitro in vivo systems, and that's challenging sometimes because the relationship between the substrate and the rumen volume in some in vitro techniques is not the same as in the animal. The dilution rate, the residence time of the substrate is different. So there has to be some guidelines to follow on trying to use the best practice possible. Then how to set up short and long-term in vivo experiments, depending on whether it's dairy or beef, in confined and grazing systems. How to initially design the experiment so we can have the maximum statistical power to detect significant differences with different experimental designs, like continuous design or Latin square, etc. There are issues that need to be seriously considered initially before starting the trials. We still have options of trying to assess some of the compounds in early life and depending on the production system, but there are many other aspects, one of them being the delivery of the compound. We know that some of the products that are very close to be available in the market still have issues on how to deliver those compounds into the animal, in the rumen, in a optimized manner in grazing system, for instance. So we still have to provide guidelines on that and how to assess the persistency of the effects, residual effects, animal health, especially related to some registration processes, etc. On a third level, we aim to provide guidelines on how to describe the mode of action of these compounds and for two reasons, basically, because if we know how they work, we can optimize the use, so we know when they work better than and when they don't work, and also because in most of the registration regulatory processes, this is compulsory. So we have now access to a range of techniques from wet microbiology to omics techniques that can facilitate describing this mode of action at the microbiome level. And also we can consider in the case of different additives that have different mechanism of action, whether we can explore the complementarity of these different additives, which is something that it hasn't been done that much. So this is block one, and then we aim to have a second block trying to deal with a different level of assessment, so different guidelines, but still very necessary. So on a fourth chapter, we aim to provide guidelines on testing at farm level, so dealing with how the additive can be implemented in different farm systems, what kind of animals is going to be used with, so either only lactating animals, how they are going to be included in the pellet, and then assess the impact through modeling using, for instance, a life cycle assessment. So we need to provide some guidelines specific for including feed additives in this exercise, farm level cost assessment, how to consider the whole value chain. So these aspects that sometimes are not addressed in depth, and they are equally important when it comes to implementing feed additives in the livestock sector. And on the last chapter, we deal with the registration and the accounting. So we, as I said before, we need to be aware of the regulatory context. The jurisdiction in different countries, regions of the world is very different, social context as well, political context. And yeah, of course, we know the guidelines from a European agency, from FDA, from MPI in New Zealand, Australian government, but there are many other regions of the world that have a different context that need to be considered as well. So if the feed additive has to be developed to be marketed in that area, needs to be considered to full extent. Then one thing is the registration, but then the accounting, how we can monitor that the feed additives are used in a proper manner, and how we can implement and put in place a system that ensure that the feed additive is being used, and we can monitor when it's used properly and when it's not. So we can transfer that implementation into the accounting system, what barriers we may face to achieve that, and how we can translate to that into different kind of inventories that the industry is very, and the governments are really, really interested. So all that area about registration and accounting is something that we aim to cover as well, and we need a specific expertise to develop these guidelines. So to conclude the main aspects of this flagship project, it's important to say that it was conceived, or it is conceived, to help both academy and industry. So it's trying to facilitate the development and the implementation of feed additives, not only purely research. Of course, it's very ambitious because it aims to cover a wide range of expertise that we need to use. So it's this is open for collaborators from many fields and from many regions of the world, for the reasons I gave before. So of course, if any of you or your colleagues are interested in participating, please contact us. And the way you can contact us is through Florencia Garcia, and this is her email address, and you can pass her any questions, requests you may have about the project. And with that said, Harry, I'm not sure if I was on time, but this is what I wanted to say about the flagship project and the main issues that we want to cover. And of course, as you can see, we are at the initial steps of the project, only 1 month running, but we are ambitious, and we hope that we can get to the technical guidelines on time.
Thanks, David. I hope I'm now on screen. Can I just ask a question to kick off? And particularly, this is around incorporation of mitigations into things like national inventories and life cycle analysis, are you going to cover questions around the level of evidence needed for them to be incorporated into those accounting systems? Because with very limited levels of evidence, there's often accusations of greenwashing. There's also the issue of quantification in terms of a small number of experiments might make it difficult to accurately quantify that effect in different situations. And I just wondered, have you given thought to how you will handle that sort of level of evidence? And people are looking often for quite simple rules. Is it 3 experiments? Is it 4 experiments? And I wondered, were you going to cover that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Harry. Yeah, we've been thinking about that. We haven't obviously developed this part yet, but of course we need to provide some guidelines on how to address the level of evidence. In some cases, it's going to be subject to the regulatory framework of specific areas, and that's very well defined in some areas, what is needed to really provide the evidence to really accept that as a feed additives to reduce methane emissions. In other places, that regulation might not be in place. So our work is to trying to provide a minimum requirements so that evidence is justified. So yeah, we're going to work on that. And then on a second level, how to, once we've got the evidence that works, how we monitor when the additives in the market can be tracked, and it can be follow up that it is being used in a good manner, and then there is an accounting system in place. So for instance, for national inventories, how do they deal with knowing what farms use the additive, to what level, to what type of livestock within the farm? So all those issues that are important when it comes to accounting system, at least for those that are on the advanced tier 2 or tier 3 system. Obviously, it's different for tier 1 inventories, and this is something that we need to also to cover, hopefully, in that chapter.
Thanks, David. Just another one here. I'm trying to paraphrase the question. Do you feel that we actually have enough evidence, particularly over the longer term, with experiments over the longer term, to really understand efficacy in that long term? Because we have a lot of short-term experiments, and as I understand it, you're not going to be doing any experimentation here. You are going to be using literature. And do you think there is a need for longer term, work at farm level to get information that will give us the confidence to get better uptake and to get these mitigations into accounting systems? And do you think that's a gap that you're going to have to address at some stage?
So the answers to the two questions are no and yes. So no, we haven't got enough evidence to know what happens in the long term in a range of different systems for those additives that work. And yes, we need to continue to work on that area. As you said, we are not going to conduct experimental research as such, but we can provide suggestions or guidelines on how we could approach this, because there are many questions that are still pending on, we know that the archaea path or the methanogenesis pathway is relatively simple compared to others, but there might be surprises in the long term that we are not anticipated, and I think for both dairy and beef cattle systems, especially for dairy, maybe we are in real need of having more information on the long term. So full lactation, more than one lactation, etc., which is still not there. No, it's not in place. So yeah, the idea is to provide guidelines, suggestions, and then maybe some other projects can take on that.
Thanks, David. Another one here is: have you thought of looking specifically at the role of genetic modification in rumen microbes?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. because I know there are the companies that are considering this route, but at the moment I can see that there are big regulatory barriers and that might stop that. And it's a good point that we might consider as in one of the chapters of a way of developing, identify new targets in the first chapter. And it's true that although we consider the in silico and the computational modeling as one action, then the genetic modification can be included, probably not in depth, but because there's not much done so far. But yeah, there is obviously, technically, there is a huge potential there. So it's a good point that we might consider to cover it. Yeah.
Right. And this would have to be the final one, David, and I'm sure we could continue for a while, but we do have to bring this to a halt. Will you be looking at animal welfare assessment as well as animal health when you look at the registration and the acceptability of additives? How broad will your assessment be and your guidelines?
Yeah, well, I cannot answer that in detail, but from my experience here in Europe, both animal health and welfare needs to be addressed to some extent, depending on the type of compound. But you need to report on dry matter intake and other issues that are related to animal behavior. So yeah, I included in the slides animal health and welfare because yeah, there are some parameters that need to be covered in terms of physiology, biochemistry of blood samples, even biopsies, etc. But yeah, animal welfare will be also covered in the guidelines.
Okay, thanks very much, David. There are a couple of other questions, but I'm sorry, we've actually run out of time. We'll make sure those other questions are answered when we summarize them. So thanks very much, David. Fascinating talk. I'd now like to move on to our second talk, which is from Klaus Deblitz at the Thunen Institute in Germany. Klaus is the deputy director of the institute, and he specializes in the analysis of beef, sheep, and pig production systems and the economic drivers and perspectives, and he does this on a worldwide basis. He has coordinated the global network Agri-Benchmark Beef and Sheep for the last 20 years. And if that wasn't enough, in 2015, he decided to coordinate the Agri-Benchmark Pig process as well. And all told, he's had over 30 years experience in analyzing production systems worldwide, looking at their sustainability, looking at their practical ways of changing those systems, and looking at it from a policy perspective. During his 30 years, he's also worked in South America, New Zealand, and Australia. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Klaus to discuss and outline the work he's doing on his GRA flagship.
Thank you very much, Harry, and GRA Secretariat for organizing this, and also welcome to everybody else in this call, in this video call here. I'm glad to see so many are interested. I hope that you can see my presentation here. Just a second. I think now it should be full screen, or do you still see my presentation view? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so this project is called this. I think we have a lot of overlap already with the previous presentation by David. One would be basically in the way that we approach this. So you will see in the working packages that we developed some parallels to what David presented, and also of course for me as an economist was most interesting when you started talking about costs and benefits. So that is where I would immediately offer cooperation, because when you look at the title of our flagship project here, feed additives will definitely play a role, among other things. So the flagship is called Economics of Greenhouse Gas Mitigation at Farm Level in Global Cattle Production Systems. And just to let you know who we are here, that's myself, That's Nina Grasnik, who a lot of you might know from her role that she also has in the GRA secretary, and Katrin Ageten. And our contact data are on the last slide. So the situation, I really followed quite a bit the template that I was given by Heather, and also try to use the headers provided in that template. So the situation here, or the problem, is that we already know that there are quite some greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, but the economic perspective is very often missing, or it's certainly a challenge to analyze that, especially the cost of implementation and realization of GHG mitigation strategies at the farm level are not so well known, and that is why we thought we could make a contribution here by providing data for economic assessment in a comparable way. Then we also know that the mitigation potential cost and of production, and also mitigation costs, they vary between production systems, but also even within the same production systems. You will see that in some of my slides. And then the countries, of course, politicians, decision makers need cost data to implement their NDCs and to decide how to efficiently allocate financial resources to support climate change mitigation measures. And the question was, why is a global collaborative approach required to solve this? I mean, this whole situation, as we know, has to be addressed globally because it's a global issue, greenhouse gases. And of course, this cannot be done by a single organization because we need the local knowledge, we need to overcome language barriers, and we need access to producers, because that's more or less the core of this project, working with producers and local experts. Coming from that situation, the objectives are first to investigate the feasibility and cost effectiveness of GHG mitigation strategies on farm level, to identify the most cost-effective management and technology options in different global production systems and regions, and to provide evidence-based policy recommendation on GHG mitigation strategies at the farm level. We are certainly much less sophisticated here than the science people. We use what we apply in the agri-benchmark networks, standard operational procedure for typical farms. So that's important to know that this is not creating representative data sets. The simple reason is that we go very deep into the production systems. And when we do that on global level, we basically have to compromise between the data quantity and the data depth that we have. And this approach of typical farms is trying to serve this objective. It's definitely not perfect, but it can be built over time to some to getting close to it, put it this way. Then we use, of course, for the emission calculations, we use first of all IPCC 2019 version. We have that built in our system here. So that goes is basically integrated. And as a global approach, we feel that we really have to use IPCC because it's also the global approach, but we are planning to include national GHG calculators, or let's say coefficients, in the course of the project, if that provides better and more realistic and more feasible results. And within this, we work with focus groups, which consist of producers, of advisors, and local experts, and of course the partners in the project. And the working steps here, you see some work packages that we have analyzed. We have a setup here. So the first step would be the collection of data for the baseline, so for the reference unit that we offer to everybody participating in the project to use our tools, data and formats. And then basically, once we have the baseline, we define, specify, and quantify mitigation measures. We calculate results and produce a database which is supposed to be updated annually, because the economics basically change annually with prices, etc. And especially in the situation that we have now with a global, with a more or less local conflict here in Europe and other global conflicts which impact heavily on agricultural markets. Then in a later stage, we would also like to analyze co-benefits and constraints, because we often found there are great practices and great tools, and we can calculate that they can create multiple wins, but then you ask yourself, why are they are not applied widely? And that's where this work package will be directed to. And then we have also a work package analyzing adopting barriers that is basically closely linked here to this other point. And then we would like to develop policy recommendations, and eventually we also want to look at upscaling. I think this is something that also David mentioned in his presentation. So the countries that we have, we differentiate here in countries that are active at the moment, that have already contributed data. That's Argentina. We also worked with Florencia there in the beginning, and it's interesting to learn that she basically moved to David's project here. We also work with Australia, Colombia, Germany, Peru, Portugal so far, and we have another number here of countries listed. So far we have basically focused on beef production, but we also having plans to include dairy production in this. Yeah, then the activities. So we basically started 1.5 years ago. We developed all this in online meetings, and then we had a kickoff meeting, and right after that the presentation and the approval in the GRA Council meeting with the country champions, etc. We had some meeting in between, and then we collected data, and in June we presented the first results in the Agri-Benchmark Beef and Sheep Conference here in Germany, in Braunschweig, which was also a hybrid format where quite some people from outside could join. I'm now showing you some really preliminary results, so you just get a taste of how it looks like, what we are doing. And this is of course also for discussion, but you can see this typical way of comparing these typical farms. So you see the country, 2 digits always, PT means Portugal, then you have Argentina, Peru, Australia here as examples in this for the cow-calf production. So cow-calf means basically producing a calf and weaning that calf for further backgrounding or finishing, and that the system boundary is basically from birth to weaning in our case here. And you see the country digits here, and then you have a number, which means 250 cows here in the case of Portugal, and then another number behind a 0, or there might be also a number which means that they also do the finishing in what we would call a complete cycle. So the farms here in Argentina and the 2 farms in Australia, they also finish their own weaners. But what you see here is just the cow-calf enterprise, and you see that the unsurprisingly when you look at the total emissions here per 100 kilogram live weight added, you see that the enteric fermentation unsurprisingly has the highest share. And I would like to say that the cow-calf is in many countries, in many systems, the bigger problem, if you want so, in terms of emissions than the beef finishing. And you also see already the big variation here that you have. You see some extreme here in Peru, which is basically a system that is then characterized by very low performance in this farm. And we would say that the cow-calf is actually, how to say, providing a pre-productive overhead to when you look at emissions. And the main reason is the cow and the herd productivity or performance. And this can usually be addressed with land use stocking rates, sequestration services, and also with improving the performance of the animals, like calving rates and proper management. So we cannot go into all detail. I just picked out one case here, this Peru case. So we basically calculated here what would happen if you introduced here a silvopasture system in this type of farm, which basically means that you turn your pasture management into some rotational grazing, and then you add fences, you start to rotate the animals, which is always the key from our experience. And then you basically plant trees, hedges, and bushes maybe that animals can also eat. And then you have an effect on the CO2 on the CO2 equivalence here. This is a preliminary simulation, so some things are missing, but we can also already say that SPS silvopasture establishment is relatively expensive in terms of investment as well as maintenance, and it basically also needs know-how to manage it. So that these are the two aspects actually. When you establish such a system, you need capital access, you need interest rates that you can pay, and you need a credit line that is also running long enough so that you can serve it, and you need the know-how to implement it. Coming to the finishing enterprises here you see a more colorful picture, which is basically because the production systems are varying. So the first one here is the German farm based on corn silage, where you see the feed CO2 is very important compared to enteric fermentation and other sources. In the Peruvian, you have a feedlot, which is basically a grain-fed system, and the others you see are grazing systems with different, people would say, intensities, where this Australian farm in the north of Queensland basically sticks out, which has also a very low performance, and that of course is basically reflected. And here you see again some animal performance indicators like daily weight gain, age at end. The finishing period is also an important element here, and also the net gain. And these elements also have the very high impact on the emission intensity, as well as the housing and the manure management system. And that is why we did one calculation here for the German farm, where we basically simulated the addition of a calcium cyanamide substrate. So we did not simulate here feed additives, because we do not feel that we have enough data. This is basically addressing the manure. And we basically can see an effect here, which is reducing the total emissions, mainly in the manure management area here, by 13% of the total. And that of course comes again with a cost, which is well, basically for the product you apply, but then also you could probably reduce the fertilizer amount, and also the cost against that. So we have not basically calculated through all this, but maybe this gives you kind of idea what we are doing here. And this is basically my last slide already. So opportunities to get involved and our next steps. So I must say that so far we have run this project with only exclusively own resources. So we have not managed to get project funding to this. I would say that first of all, this project is also completely open to GRA members. Researchers with interest, please contact us. And they can be from countries which are already participating, or from countries not participating. And then we would jointly decide where it's best to get involved, beef and or dairy. And I just want to say that starting from scratch is an effort in terms of data collection, at least in the first year, because we would basically have to put all the data on the production system, on the economics and the emissions together. So the idea is now to consolidate and update the existing figures. As you saw, there are some more figures from some other countries. Then we would basically add new countries and case studies. But probably before we would prepare a publication on what we have so far and use that to get funding for upscaling the project and also to really employ someone, be it here in Germany or somewhere else, is not so important. Yeah, that's basically from my side. I hope I could keep my time. You see our contact data here on this slide, and that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus. I'm hoping our technology is there. Klaus, just a very simple question to start with is, what kind of data are needed for a country to become a partner? What sort of data would they need to be able to become participants in your project?
Well, look, as we work on the farm level, we would basically need information on, let's say, the number of animals, the performance of the animals. Let's take cow-calf, like calving percentage, weights of the animals by animal category, the whole sales, reproduction parameters, land use, and also the input of capital, which is something we can probably reduce a little bit, but the land use, of course, is very important. The amount of fertilizer they use, if they use any, and so on. And then all the prices, of course, that belong to that. And in terms of emissions, it's actually designed in a way that we need basically a lot of codes for this, yeah, to basically to specify yeah, pasture situation, confined situation, you know that from the IPCC. And then we need the feed details, we need the feed rations, the ingredients of the feed, and we need the climate data. So that's basically what you need. As you see, it's quite comprehensive. Thank you.
Another question is that you looked at your slide, you showed the differences between different countries. Do you have enough data within countries to capture the variability that may exist across systems within a country, as opposed to the variability you see between countries?
We are aiming to get there. We have in our data set, you know, we started using data that we already have in our data set. So we did not have to collect the performance, production system, and economic data. That was already there. And we have in some countries like Australia, many more farms. The same applies to Germany and to Argentina and Brazil, if we take that in. And we basically found, at least for when you look at beef finishing, that we have main systems would be silage, grain fed, pasture, and cut and carry, where we see differences in the cost structure, but also quite an impact on the emission levels. And we would definitely follow that path to show differences between countries as well, as long as there are really different production system existing. But let me just say, I once learned that a cow clone on the same pasture would basically burp 30 to 50% different, and nobody really knows why that is. So we have to be aware that we cannot represent whole countries with these data, but we can aim at reflecting the main production systems in the main regions, so that we also represent a high market share with these systems.
Follow up on that. So again, it's just a quite detailed question around information. How many farms within a country do you feel that you need information on so you can participate in your project?
I would not set a limit here at this stage. I will be happy to start with something, because our approach is, you know, if we go there too ambitious in a way that we explain the whole world from the beginning, we will not probably manage. So our approach with everything has always been, let's start with something reasonable. Let's start with something feasible. Let's gain experience together as in a network approach. Hopefully also success, and then grow it. That is how we develop these networks. But I can tell you, just let me just take Germany as an example. When you look at beef finishing, for example, or cow calf, let me say, just as a ballpark figure, for the analysis we did so far in terms of production systems economics and competitiveness, etc., we do not need more than 12 farms for each of these production systems in Germany. After that, you basically spend a lot of time, but the gain in evidence is diminishing. You know, it's like a diminishing rate of return in economics. So once you are reached a certain level, yeah, that is a relationship that is basically worsening.
And again, another very practical question: do you have, or are you willing to use default values where countries don't have the full data set, or will that defeat the purpose of what you're trying to do?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. Yes, we do in certain areas. So we basically we put codes to our feed ingredients. Yeah. So, and the code is basically then related to the Dutch database developed by Wageningen, where we have like, I think 1,000 whatever feed stuff. So if the partners are not able to provide what we need, which is basically dry matter, raw protein, and metabolic energy, or NEL for the dairy, if they cannot provide that, then we would take the default data, and that applies to some other elements, but we always try to really get the data from specific data from the country, and not from databases. But these databases are, of course, extremely helpful.
Yeah, another really practical question: what models are you using for developing your scenarios and assessing the farm systems in each country? Are you using a standard model, or are there different approaches that are fit towards the system of which you're working in?
Yeah, thanks. It's maybe not so easy to answer this question. Depends on what you understand what a model is. Yeah. So we use indeed a computer tool. That is what I understand is a model, and that is basically a model which is an Excel-based model, which is very old-fashioned. I'm aware of this. That's a combined production and accounting model for the business as usual, and that is now linked to the calculation of greenhouse gases, where we've just implemented the IPCC coefficients and all the data that is relevant, lookup tables for the temperatures and all kind of other things, and link that with our data. So that's what we understand as a model. So we are not using one of the standard emission calculators, simply because we found that first of all, most of them do not provide different or so much better results than we can do ourselves. And second, interfacing is a big problem. So we want to avoid to be forced to put in data twice. So we try to keep it in our system, but that of course is completely open to everybody who participates. So everybody can have this and do own calculations with it.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions of my own. I've got some more to answer. I've got a couple of my own. How do you see farmers actually using this information, or is it not really aimed at farmers?
I would say it's we typically work on a meta level, put it this way, as a research institution, but we work very closely with producers. So we basically collect data from and together with producers, but let's say the deal always is that they get something back. Yeah, so they would basically, for example, they would basically get me as a presenter. I don't know if that's really so attractive, but I tell them, if we give you results back that we calculated with your data. So for example, here in Germany, I'm somehow touring a little bit through the regions with where the advisor extension organizations have some, they do some events, and I then present their farm basically, if you want so, in the global comparison and with everything that we basically did their system, economics, and now emissions. If I don't know if that is an answer to your question.
Thank you. I've actually got a follow-up to that one, which really comes back from you saying you're doing work in Germany and you're already working in detail. There will be many countries that are working in detail on this in their own right. So I know New Zealand has got quite a large program of looking at farm level emissions and looking how you can mitigate. So my question comes around to, how do you see an international project like this adding value to those domestic efforts? So what do you see the value of this that's additional to the domestic efforts?
Yeah, another excellent question. Thank you. Well, first of all, we try to make things comparable. We are not saying that we are better than others, but we try to make things comparable because we do everything in the same way. We are also not saying that this is the right way. We just say this is the way we do, and we agree with the participants, and then we make it transparent. So, and if someone is not happy with it, then they can make other assumptions, and that at least it applies to the economic analysis. So that's the first thing: comparability of a standardization, let's say, globally. Second thing is, of course, if if there are other data sets, then we try to incorporate that, be it with a technical interface, if people are happy with it, or basically in a side way by comparing ours with what is already available in these countries. And the third thing I would say is really a value that is the exchange between people, basically to learn from each other who is doing what, and maybe also revise own approaches, methods, data, etc. Because meeting with these people probably makes us not more working together makes us not more stupid than we are already.
Thank you, Klaus. Now I've got quite a number of questions of people asking how to join, how they can participate. And we will be leaving your email addresses, etc., and how to contact you on the screen at the end, and also there will be details on the Global Research Alliance website. But I have got one final question. That is one that we always have to face as when we're looking at livestock systems. That one possible GHG mitigation measure is simply to reduce the number of ruminants, especially in the global north, and we're also, can reduce subsidies, etc. Will you be including this as part of your analysis of mitigation approaches?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I mean,
that's why I left it until last.
No, Harry, very good, because you did this wonderful methane versus CO2 presentation at our conference, and yeah, of course, I mean that is something. I mean, it's probably a reality if we follow this methane discussion, that if we reduce cattle, just looking at emissions now, then we could probably gain time. But at the end of the day, we know that getting rid of all let's say herbivores, yeah, that's a different thing than ruminants only. It's probably not such a good idea, because so far we cannot do much with the grasslands, and then there are all these co-benefits, etc., etc. We cannot really go into that. I think we will consider this question, yes, but not as a systematic approach. I mean, we can calculate the reduction of emission in short term if you cut cattle numbers by half, but then you also need to say the downsides of all that. So I don't see this happening, but I would also like to say that you can also eat grass with species that are not ruminants. And I mean, that is something maybe people sometimes forget, but there is also a lot of cultural and whatever kind of reasons behind.
Thank you. Now, I will actually just finish up, just because you've raised that about other animals. Do you, when you're modeling, consider other large ruminants like buffaloes and potentially semi-ruminants like camels? Will your analysis extend to that?
I don't know if I will be able to do that still, because I have 6 years left in office. So I would leave that to my successors. But I think it's a really interesting question. But I would just not want to overload this project. You know, I think we will focus for the time being on beef and on dairy. And once we have achieved something there, then I think it would be good. But we will certainly have to keep that in mind. But I would not really put it on the agenda at the moment.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for answering that very broad range of questions. And could we bring David back on, please, just to finish off today? I have got one more question for David, if David is actually on the line. And David, this was just an extension of a couple of questions that came before. Would you be, in your guidelines, will you also be considering the human health aspects potentially of additives, and whether they have any impact on human health, and right through to impacts in ruminant products or animal products? How will you actually go into that within your guidelines?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I try to answer that one in the Q&A, and we will definitely cover the potential effects and how to address them on animal health, and I can see the interest of covering also indirect effects on human health. I think we need to cover it. Where I cannot guarantee what level of detail we will cover that, depending on the expertise we have, but it's clearly something that we need to address in terms of transferring compounds into milk, meat, and potentially humans. Yeah, and there are some examples of additives that are being tested at the moment that are very relevant in that regard. So on animal health, yes, and in a good detail, I hope. On human health, we will probably touch it. I'm not sure to what level of detail, depending on how much time and expertise we have in our group.
Thanks, David. Now, I'll throw you one very curly one at the end, which is always a difficult one, and one that politicians never like to hear, in terms of the length of time it takes to get something from discovery through to on the market, through to regulation, through to uptake in accounting. Do you have any guesstimates as to how long you think that will take once you get the rigor of data you need to include in accounting systems and be able to, really justify that these are making a difference? There was a question in the chat, and I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, I'll try to be as accurate as I can. Of course, depends on the country of the region, on the regulatory framework. I can say that in the case of bovine, for instance, from having evidence and consistent evidence and publications to going through the whole regulatory process in EFSA, it was a few years. So the whole process probably 12-15 years, but I can see that it is a long and costly process, both. So time and money, I think are both limiting factors. But yeah, it's not quick. But I can also see that in some other areas, it might be quicker.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the first bovine experiments were in about 2011. And it's only just coming on the market. That's 11 years and 50 publications. It shows exactly how difficult it is. Thank you. And thank you both, David and Klaus, for really excellent presentations and for answering some pretty searching questions. It was really excellent. So I'd now like to draw that to an end and really like to thank not only the two speakers giving up their time, but also thank Deborah and Heather in the Secretariat for organising this and getting it to run very smoothly. So big clap to them. And just a reminder to everyone that this is part of a series of webinars. And please check our website for the next webinars on the flagships. And there will be, the next one will be on November the 3rd. I don't have the time details, but they will be on the GRA website. And please, if you really do want to get involved in any of these projects, you can email the Secretariat, or directly email Klaus or David, so to discuss how you can become involved in these two flagships. And I did notice that quite a number of people in the Q&A have asked how they can be involved. So please contact either David or Klaus or the Secretariat, who can make sure that you can be put in touch with the relevant people. So thank you all for participating tonight. And we hope to see you again at the next meetings in this series on November the 3rd. So for me, it may be good morning for you, but for me, it's good night. It is past my bedtime, so it's midnight. So thank you again.